France stepped forward, and Washington noticed immediately. It was not the kind of announcement that arrives with a press conference and a prepared statement. It came through the accumulated weight of smaller signals, policy shifts, diplomatic language that changed in tone, and a set of decisions at the European level that, taken individually, might seem routine, but viewed together form a picture that senior analysts in Washington have not been able to ignore. France is moving, and in the architecture of Western strategic alignment, when France moves, everything around it has to adjust. This is not simply a story about one country's foreign policy. It is a story about the Western alliance entering a phase it has not navigated before. One where Europe is no longer content to stand in a support role, while Washington sets the direction. The implications for Ukraine are immediate. The implications for NATO's internal coherence are structural. And the implications for the broader competition between Western democracies and Russia extend well beyond the current conflict into a time frame that most public conversation has not yet caught up to. To understand why this moment is significant, it is necessary to understand what France has been building toward for years, and why the war in Ukraine accelerated a timeline that, under different circumstances, might have taken a decade to unfold. For the better part of Emmanuel Macron's presidency, France has pursued what European defense circles call strategic autonomy. The phrase has been used so often that it risks becoming diplomatic wallpaper, but its meaning is precise, and in the current environment, genuinely consequential. Strategic autonomy does not mean Europe acting against the United States. It means Europe developing the institutional capacity, the defense industrial base, and the political will to make independent security decisions that do not require Washington's prior approval or financial underwriting to execute. In practical terms, it means European nations holding the capability to act when American political will is uncertain, or when American strategic priorities diverge from European ones. For years, this idea was treated in Washington with a mixture of mild skepticism and polite tolerance. It was seen as a French philosophical preference, something rooted in Gaullism, in France's historical insistence on independence, in the fact that France is the only EU member with a permanent seat on the UN Security Council and an independent nuclear deterrent. It was easy to note, and not take entirely seriously, that changed when Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine began in February 2022. Suddenly, strategic autonomy was not a theory, it was a necessity. Europe discovered, in the early weeks and months of the war, that its defense industrial base was not prepared for a sustained conventional conflict on its eastern border. Ammunition stockpiles that seemed adequate for peacetime exercises and limited operations proved insufficient when measured against the consumption rates of actual warfare. Artillery rounds that European nations pledged to Ukraine were drawn from reserves that could not be replenished quickly enough to satisfy either the battlefield need or the Allied commitment. Defense manufacturing, long underfunded, restructured for efficiency rather than surge capacity, could not simply scale up on command. The entire assumption that Europe could rely on American industrial output as a backstop was still present, but the political durability of that assumption had begun to crack. France read this situation clearly. What followed was not a dramatic announcement, but a sustained and deliberate reorientation. French defense spending accelerated. The Defense Industrial Programming Law passed in 2023 committed France to significant increases in military investment through the end of the decade, with specific emphasis on capabilities relevant to high-intensity conflict, air defense, long-range precision fires, armored systems, and the kind of logistical infrastructure that sustained warfighting requires. At the European level, France pushed for joint procurement mechanisms, for European defense investment funds, for coordination frameworks that would reduce the fragmentation that had historically kept European defense efforts weaker than their combined budgets suggested. None of this happened overnight, but by early 2025, the cumulative effect was visible in ways that earlier years had not produced. Washington noticed for two distinct reasons, and it is important to keep both in frame simultaneously. The first reason is strategic alignment. France's enhanced engagement on Ukraine and European security does not pull away from NATO, it reinforces it. Every additional European capability reduces the burden on American assets, extends the alliance's collective deterrence, and demonstrates to adversaries that the Western commitment to European security is not contingent on any single capital's political temperature. In this sense, France's assertiveness is directly in America's interest, and significant voices in Washington, particularly those who have spent careers in transatlantic security, understand this well. The concern is not that France is becoming a rival. The concern is coordination, ensuring that French initiatives are synchronized with NATO planning, that European procurement decisions feed into interoperability rather than creating parallel structures, and that the communication channels between Paris and Washington remain robust enough to manage the inevitable moments of friction. The second reason Washington is watching is harder to articulate cleanly, but it is equally real. The American political environment has over the past several years developed an internal debate about the terms of American leadership in NATO that did not exist in the same form a decade ago. Voices questioning the cost-sharing arrangements, the strategic priorities, and the depth of commitment to European security have moved from the periphery towards something closer to mainstream policy discussion. Against that backdrop, France's increased assertiveness carries a subtext that some in Washington read with mixed feelings. Europe is preparing for the possibility that American strategic reliability cannot be taken for granted indefinitely. That is not an accusation, it is a contingency plan. But contingency plans, when they become visible, change the political atmosphere in the room. The gap between those two readings, France as reinforcing partner versus France as hedging ally, has not resolved itself. It is in fact one of the most important unresolved tensions inside the Western alliance right now, and understanding it is essential to interpreting almost everything that follows. Against this backdrop, France's most recent decisions carry weight that extends beyond their technical content. The specific measures under discussion involve a combination of defense commitments, diplomatic positioning, and statements about the conditions under which European nations would consider direct security guarantees for Ukraine, language that goes further than much of the alliance had previously been willing to use publicly. The details remain under active negotiation, and it would be analytically irresponsible to present specific outcomes as settled when diplomatic consultations are still ongoing. What can be assessed with confidence is the direction. France is moving toward a more explicit security commitment posture in Eastern Europe, and it is doing so in a way that places maximum pressure on its European partners to move with it, rather than waiting for an American lead. This matters enormously for Ukraine. The most immediate question facing Kiev's strategic planners is not whether Western support will continue in some form, it almost certainly will, but whether that support will be durable enough, consistent enough, and capable enough to sustain Ukraine through a conflict that Russia has clearly decided to fight as a prolonged attrition campaign. Russia's strategy, as best as analysts can read it from observable patterns, is not built around delivering a single decisive military blow. It is built around outlasting the West's political will to maintain support. Every delay in weapons delivery, every moment of European hesitation, every American political cycle that introduces uncertainty about commitment, these are, from Moscow's perspective, elements of a strategy that does not require military victory in the conventional sense. It requires Western endurance to break before Russian endurance does. France's current posture represents a direct challenge to that calculation. By moving toward longer-term, more institutionalized commitments, rather than episode-by-episode decisions that require constant political renewal, Paris is attempting to close the strategic gap that Moscow is trying to exploit. This is not charity, it is cold strategic logic. If Ukraine falls, the eastern frontier of NATO faces a threat posture that would require far more expensive deterrence indefinitely. The arithmetic of early investment versus later cost is not favorable to passivity. But here is where the narrative becomes more complicated, and where the observable reality begins to diverge from the public confidence. France, like every European nation currently deepening its commitments on Ukraine and European defense, is doing so under constraints that do not resolve simply because the strategic logic is clear. Domestic political conditions across Europe remain complicated. The far-right and far-left forces that have argued for reduced engagement with Ukraine, drawing on economic anxiety, energy cost pressures, and a strain of anti-establishment sentiment that feeds on public exhaustion, have not disappeared. In France specifically, the political landscape after the 2024 parliamentary elections is more fragmented than it was during the earlier phase of Macron's presidency. The ability to sustain long-term defense commitments requires not just executive will, but parliamentary support, budgetary consensus, and public understanding of why these costs are necessary. None of those conditions are automatic. The defense industrial ramp-up is proceeding, but it has not caught up to the stated ambitions. Manufacturing capacity for key weapons systems, particularly artillery ammunition, air defense interceptors, and precision-guided munitions, remains constrained by workforce bottlenecks, raw material supply chains, and the simple fact that high-complexity defense manufacturing cannot be conjured quickly, even with committed investment. There is a gap between what France and its European partners are pledging and what they can physically deliver within the timelines that the battlefield currently demands. Analysts tracking the logistics of European arms deliveries to Ukraine are aware of this gap, and it represents a vulnerability in the overall support architecture that adversaries are also watching. Russia's response to all of this has been, by recent historical standards, notably measured. This is itself analytically significant. Moscow's public statements have acknowledged the European shifts without the kind of rhetorical escalation that characterized earlier phases of the war. Russia's foreign ministry and official media have noted France's moves with commentary that falls short of the threatening register that has defined Moscow's messaging at previous inflection points. Whether this reflects genuine strategic restraint, an assessment that the European moves are not yet militarily decisive, or a deliberate effort to avoid giving European publics a reason to rally more firmly behind their government's increased commitments, probably some combination of all three, the observable behavior suggests a Russian leadership that is recalculating rather than preacting. That recalculation is worth examining carefully because it is happening across multiple dimensions simultaneously. On the military level, Russia continues to press in eastern Ukraine with the grinding, resource-intensive approach that has characterized the conflict for over 2 years. Territorial gains have been incremental rather than dramatic, but the operational cost to Ukraine has been real and sustained. The question for Russian planners is whether the pace of European rearmament will translate into materially improved Ukrainian military capacity within a timeline that changes the battlefield calculus, or whether the timeline will be long enough that Russian attrition absorbs the impact. Based on current observable data, delivery schedules, training pipelines, industrial output, this remains a genuinely open question, and its openness is itself a form of leverage for Moscow. On the economic level, Russia has spent the past 3 years adapting to Western sanctions pressure, with a degree of resilience that initially surprised many analysts. The Russian economy has contracted and been distorted by sanctions, but it has not collapsed. Defense industrial output has increased significantly, funded by energy revenues that, despite partial Western pressure, continue to flow through non-Western buyers, particularly in Asia. Russia has restructured its external trade relationships, its payment systems, and its energy export routes in ways that have reduced, though not eliminated, the leverage that Western economic pressure can apply. The energy card, which was expected to be Russia's most vulnerable point after the European energy crisis of 2022, remains a tool that Moscow can still use if more selectively than before. This brings the narrative to what is arguably its most structurally important dimension: energy and the geopolitical competition that now surrounds it. The relationship between European energy security and the Ukraine conflict has evolved in ways that are not yet fully visible in mainstream analysis. When Europe undertook its rapid diversification away from Russian gas beginning in 2022, it achieved something that many experts had said would be impossible on the timeline. Europe executed it. Functional replacement of Russian pipeline gas with liquefied natural gas from the United States, Qatar, Norway, and other suppliers. The cost was significant. European energy prices spiked to levels that reshaped industrial economics across the continent and contributed to a period of sustained inflationary pressure. But Europe survived the winter, and then it survived another. The acute dependency on Russian energy that had been the central vulnerability in European strategic positioning for 2 decades was not eliminated, but it was dramatically reduced. However, reducing dependency is not the same as achieving security. The new energy architecture that Europe built in the urgency of 22 and 2023 is more diversified, but also more complex, more expensive, and more exposed to different categories of risk. The global LNG market, while substantially larger than a decade ago, is competitive. Asian demand, particularly from Japan, South Korea, and China, competes directly with European demand for the same cargoes, especially during periods of seasonal peak consumption or supply disruption. The shipping routes that carry LNG from production regions to European import terminals traverse some of the world's most strategically sensitive maritime corridors: the Strait of Hormuz, the Red Sea, the waters around the Arabian Peninsula. Several of those routes have experienced elevated tension over the past 18 months as a result of conflicts and pressures that, while related to broader geopolitical competition, are not directly about Ukraine. The disruption to Red Sea shipping from Houthi interdiction activity beginning in late 2023 redirected significant cargo volumes, increased insurance costs, added transit times, and demonstrated with uncomfortable clarity how quickly maritime supply chain assumptions can be invalidated by actors with limited conventional military power but high tolerance for escalation risk. For energy markets, the consequence was not catastrophic, but it was illustrative. The price signal was real, the logistics cost was real, the rerouting of vessels around the Cape of Good Hope added weeks to transit times and millions of dollars per shipment in fuel costs. For European energy planners watching this unfold, the lesson was not abstract. The new energy independence they had purchased at high cost was itself dependent on maintaining the security of maritime routes that were now visibly under pressure from sources that Western deterrents could not easily reach. American naval capacity remains the world's largest, but it is globally distributed and cannot simply be concentrated in every contested waterway simultaneously. European naval capacity, while not trivial, has been historically oriented toward Atlantic and Mediterranean operations, not the extended power projection required to protect critical supply lines in the Indian Ocean region. Here, the connection between France's defense posture, NATO's internal recalibration, and the global energy picture becomes visible in its full complexity. France's push for European strategic autonomy is not solely about Ukraine. It is about building the capacity to protect European interests across a wider range of scenarios, including scenarios involving energy supply security, maritime route protection, and the need to respond to crises in regions where American strategic priorities may not align with European ones. The Indo-Pacific dimension of French defense policy, often noted in relation to France's overseas territories and its status as the only European nation with a sustained naval presence in the Pacific and Indian Oceans, is not separate from the European security picture. It is part of the same strategic logic. As energy costs feed into inflation, inflation feeds into political pressure, and political pressure feeds into the sustainability of defense commitments. The loop closes. The energy dimension is not simply a background variable. It is an active element in the strategic competition, and Russia understands this as well as anyone. Moscow's positioning in global energy markets, its relationships with OPEC+ partners, its redirection of oil flows through pricing mechanisms designed to stay within Western price caps while maximizing revenue, its cultivation of long-term energy agreements with China and India is not purely economic. It is strategic messaging. We remain a necessary actor in global energy supply, and the cost of fully excluding us from that role is higher than your governments are willing to tell their publics. That message has not yet resolved into a concrete policy dilemma for Europe, but it exists as persistent background pressure. France, like every other large European economy, is managing a tension between the strategic commitment to reduce Russian leverage and the practical reality that complete strategic decoupling from a resource, as important as energy, does not happen without sustained economic pain. The political durability of that pain is not guaranteed. This is the constraint that narrows options as the situation develops, and it is the constraint that matters most in assessing what comes next. What comes next, as best as current analysis can project, involves three distinct trajectories that will develop in parallel and interact in ways that are not fully predictable. The first trajectory is European defense consolidation. France will continue to press its European partners toward deeper integration of defense planning, procurement, and strategic commitment. Some European nations, Poland, the Baltic states, the Nordic members now inside NATO, are aligned with this direction and moving faster than France in some respects, particularly in the direct commitment of military resources near Ukraine's borders. Germany remains the critical variable, large enough economically and militarily to reshape European defense capacity if it commits fully, constrained enough politically and historically to make full commitment a complex domestic negotiation. The European defense picture in 12 months will be materially different from today, but the specific shape of that difference is not yet determined. The second trajectory is Russia's strategic adaptation. Moscow will not simply absorb the increased European capability without adjustment. The adjustments are already visible in several dimensions: accelerated domestic defense production, intensified cultivation of non-Western partnerships, attempts to accelerate internal fractures within European publics on issues of economic cost and migration, and a continued reliance on the expectation that Western political will is more fragile than Western military capacity. Russian leadership has demonstrated repeatedly that it plays a longer time horizon than Western electoral cycles easily accommodate. This asymmetry in strategic patience is the factor that Western planners must address, and that is most difficult to counter through conventional policy mechanisms. The third trajectory is the global energy market's continued reconfiguration. The next 12 to 24 months will see further development of LNG infrastructure in Europe, further competition between European and Asian buyers in the global LNG market, and continued sensitivity of maritime shipping routes to the broader set of regional conflicts that are now permanently linked to the geopolitical competition between the Western order and its challengers. A significant disruption to any major shipping route during a period of tight LNG supply could produce energy price spikes that would test European political cohesion in ways that no amount of strategic planning fully insulates against. What has fundamentally changed, and what makes the current moment more consequential than it might appear from the outside, is the compression of these three trajectories into the same timeframe. European defense consolidation, Russian strategic adaptation, and global energy market pressure are not sequential problems. They are simultaneous ones. The decisions being made right now by France, by NATO allies, by energy companies, by financial markets, pricing geopolitical risk, are being made under conditions where each variable is influencing the others in real time. France's decision has signaled something that extends beyond any single policy announcement, that Europe has made a structural choice about its own role in its own security. The choice is not complete, not fully funded, and not without internal contradictions. But it is real, and it is moving faster than the public narrative has captured. Washington is watching, because the shape of the Western alliance for the next decade is being negotiated in the decisions being made right now. Russia is watching, because the window for achieving its objectives before European capacity materially shifts may be narrower than it anticipated. The signals to watch in the weeks and months ahead are specific. First, the pace of European defense procurement commitments and whether industrial delivery rates begin to close the gap with stated ambitions. Second, the evolution of France's diplomatic language on security guarantees for Ukraine and whether that language begins to be adopted by other European capitals or remains a French position. Third, Russia's military tempo in eastern Ukraine and whether any operational shifts suggest a change in the timeline assumptions that underpin current Russian strategy. Fourth, global LNG spot prices and shipping insurance rates in key maritime corridors, not because energy is the whole story, but because it is the fastest moving indicator of how much stress the broader strategic competition is producing on the systems that sustain it. The situation is not static, it is not trending toward a clear resolution, and the fact that it is complex does not make it less urgent, it makes it more so, because the complexity is precisely where the critical shifts are most likely to occur first and be most difficult to see in time. This report is based on observable developments and strategic analysis, with some details still evolving as events continue to unfold.